think about being a federal employee, a government employee of any kind, and you're given some type of, classified clearance, nothing too crazy, nothing substantial that you want to, go home and tell your friends and family about, but you're given some type of access, right? What ends up happening is you are in one part of the city that you work in on one day, and then you realize you have a meeting in the afternoon, and you're with a couple of other colleagues that are also federal employees, and you say, holy crap, you're human like everybody else. You forget that you have a meeting at a certain time, you don't think you can make it. Your friend slash colleague, who just so happens to have a higher level of classified clearance than you, says, don't worry about it. Seriously, don't worry. Just take the tube with me and we'll get there very quickly. And you think, what the hell is the tube? But you don't ask any questions. It's an underground tunnel system that is basically used and has been confirmed by certain parts of the United States government and other governments around the world. Now, you might be saying, Dave, why do you say this? I say this because we need to keep in mind the fact that the government has sort of admitted over time, very, very lightly, not in a strong way, but in a light way, that underground rail systems do in fact exist. Now, they use the word rail because, that's part of the psychological warfare and predictive programming aspect. You think rail, you think train, you think old, you don't think anything high tech or what have you. But here's the point. As you're going along this tube that has Mach tunnel speeds, this, magneto-leviton train, and by the way, this is not a deep underground military base episode, but this is important. It's making certain stops, and each stop there's a handful of what seem to be men in black suits, right? The men in black thing. But they don't really have any faces. And you don't ask any questions because you're not even supposed to be like taking this train, so to speak, or what have you, right? It's just because a friend offered you a ride through the underground, tunnel system to get to your meeting on time. Once you get to your location, you ask your friend, what were those men? And your friend says, listen, I'm not supposed to say anything. Their face kind of turns white. And they're just looking for the geneticist. And they kept asking about gate C17. And you say, I didn't hear anything about like them asking you about gate C17. He's like, oh yeah, that they asked me like this. And he uses his hand and he taps on his head, meaning telepathy. And you're like, okay. But anyways, you'll see what I mean very shortly by the end of the episode as this comes full circle. Now, before I start this, I just want to give a shout out to Deus Ex Machina as well as to Hello World for some of the articles that we'll be seeing and evaluating here in this episode. And a special thank you to CS. Brother, you know who you are. Thank you so much because a lot of what you recommended to me in the last couple of days has actually been bringing a lot of my research full circle. So I thank you very tremendously. Now, gate C17, the gene pool that all geneticists must magnetically tame. Now, before we jump into anything, what we first need to understand is that there is a constant reoccurrence of different genetic experimentation at different levels of the deep underground military base system, but that's not even the point here. TAME stands for terrestrially accepted and magnetically enhanced. Now, for those that are on Patreon and for those that have watched previous episodes in the last 3-4 months, you'll know that we've discussed about certain, I guess we could say, concentration camps for extraterrestrials or non-compliance, because Earth is not exactly as, protected and conformed as many might think. But the point for that is this. When we take a look at all of the genetic experimentation and the geneticists that are going in and out of these different places, we're going to find that a lot of it occurs near airports and through something which is now referred to, by the way, as the skip zone. Now, what is the skip zone? The skip zone, if we take a look here according to Wikipedia, is a skip zone, and I quote, also called a silent zone or zone of silence, is a region where a radio transmission cannot be received. The zone is located between regions both closer and farther from the transmitter where reception is possible. Now, the cause of it, according to Wikipedia, is that when using medium to high frequency radio telecommunication, there are radio waves which travel both parallel to the ground and towards the ionosphere, referred to as a ground wave and sky wave, respectively. A skip zone is an annular region between the farthest points at which the ground wave can be received and the nearest point at which the refracted sky waves can be received, end quote. Look, here's the interesting thing that they do. They throw it right in front of our faces with no legitimate explanation whatsoever. Okay, because here's the thing. There have been so many different patches of lands and zone of silences that have been occurring that they have to now give it a name. Take a look at when this article was updated. It wasn't. It's new. Who the hell wrote this thing? You know what I mean? Because Wikipedia, it can be edited and, by different people and different institutions and what have you. And that's because there are more and more patches of land all across the world, and it doesn't even need to be open land. It could be within a city where everything stops working. Telecommunication, radio signals, phone signals, all of that, right? And what we're going to find as well, too, is that there were certain rockets that were redirected back in the 1950s to go towards a certain radioactive and seeming to be unexplainably anomalistic frequential area that Wernher von Braun was then sent to investigate. But again, if there was nothing to look into, like the United States government says, why did Wernher von Braun spend a month and a half there? Now, the reason why I bring all of this up is because there are certain forms of holographic geneticists, all right, that are humans that are actually able to use with their mind the alteration of the genetic structure of their body that could then be changed and used to implement within these alien concentration camps that seem to be popping up and then randomly disappearing. And you might say, Dave, okay, what proof do you have of this? So let's start very, very strongly, but foundationally. Let's go to viewzone2.com. The craft is a magnetic field exclusion device. Now, this article discusses what powers or what gives the ability for these alien craft to work, but we need to read this to understand. The craft is a magnetic field exclusion device and is extremely important because it is the source of lift. We know that this can be achieved from our experience with a block of superconducting material. It follows that a kin of superconducting material will exclude external magnetic fields. From then on, the engineering is about craft density, and both the sphere and the flattened disk optimize craft density. Thus, observation is confirming the nature of the source of lift, and no new physics is called for, end quote. So, what we're doing here is we're bending space and time. What if you can bend space and time to set up holographic concentration camps right in front of us, but because they are put on certain patches of land and anomalistic patches, they, as a matter of fact, are just parallel enough in an alternate dimension or an ascended dimension, people can walk right through this zone of silence and not feel anything physical as if they're touching anything. That's what's happening here, excuse me. What we're seeing is that people who walk into these zone of silences in, Arizona, New Mexico, mainly, you name it, which also correspond with that of the subglobal network system, and those who watch the Psalm episode on Patreon, you'll know what I'm talking about. These patches of land coincide directly with airports and as well as open pieces of land like New Mexico, Arizona, like I just said. Now, the interesting thing here is this. When you go to these pieces of land, you're going to find very strange and anomalistic things occurring, such as, paranormal events. You might see a spirit, or you might see someone running at you, and then all of a sudden they run right through you, and you turn around and the person or whatever object or thing that was is gone, right? This is because when you have a certain holographically induced geneticist working on a town that is basically, again, I use the word town because it is a small city for alien concentration camps, but is harnessing this magneticism, which is also the same magneticism that is harnessed within the deep underground military bases of the example I gave at the beginning to make these trains go through, right? We're going to see here that when we look at the different terms of gate C17, what ends up happening is that within these camps, they tame them. Now, again, taming means terrestrially accepted and magnetically enhanced, which means that these beings now have the ability, they went from prisoners to becoming super soldiers, and they now have the ability to use their mind to alter some of the atoms at the most molecular and isotopic level to change their body and shapeshift. Why do I say this? Because there has been a massive, as many people know, a massive influx of immigration, particularly at the Mexico and U.S. border. Now, I'm not trying to get political or anything like this, but we have to call certain things as they are, right? And so we're going to understand that very shortly. Now, first off, the one thing I want to take a look at before we look at that here is I want to take a look at express.co.uk. And again, this is thanks to Hello World. CERN discovers satanic human sacrifice taking place in Large Hadron Collider grounds. This again was reported on August 18th, 2016. All right, so we're looking at about 5 years ago. Notice how quickly this was covered up, by the way. So let's take a look here. The footage shows a cloaked group wearing long, flowing black robes, and one appears to have hiking boots on underneath. They are seen walking around before a woman moves onto the floor and is quote-unquote stabbed. But the footage, all right, as claimed by CERN, that the ritual was simply researchers and scientists coming to work at the facility, taking their sense of humor too far, end quote. Why hasn't any other mainstream media establishment reported this at the time? Why didn't it get reported? You can look it up. Very rarely it was reported, right? And here's the interesting thing too, a quick fun fact. The people, the journalists that work at express.co.uk tend to be a lot of disgruntled journalists who feel they are being pressured by establishments like The Telegraph, The Guardian, The New York Times, CNN, The Washington Post, for not publishing what they actually want to report on, what they find. What we're seeing here, guys, is a preparation for one of these concentration camps, and the geneticists, because again, as we see here, these were simply researchers and scientists. But which scientists? Genetic scientists, if you look at the manifesto of who attended CERN at this point in time. This is how a ritual for these concentration camps begin, and it seems to enable a zone of silence. So where are you going to make a zone of silence? Where are you going to establish it using the magnetic technology that we looked at in the first article we evaluated here with regards to reverse engineering UFOs, because there's a lot of different forms of energetic frequencies and barriers that come into play here. What are you going to do? You're going to put it right in front of one of the biggest institutions that already has massive conspiracies surrounding it, because no one's going to think to look there. Where else are you going to do it? You're going to do it at airports, which is why this episode is called Gate C17, because for those that are familiar with the O'Hare incident within the one of the airports within the United States of America, I'm just going to take a look very quickly at this. We're going to see that a lot of these occurrences happen to be within the Federal Aviation Administration declined records, meaning that people who saw these UFOs within the O'Hare airport even totally denied it. They're saying they denied it, but I bring this up because these rituals are how certain magnetic fields are started, okay? And what ends up happening is that once a magnetic field is opened, they then become tamed, as I said at the beginning. And they need geneticists, because geneticists are the ones that are going to essentially, in a lot of different ways, torture these extraterrestrials because they're non-compliant, as we've spoken about on Patreon and other episodes in the past. And we'll see here that what ends up happening is it's done in front of major institutions, and it's all for many reasons, right? For, you put it right in front of everyone's face and things like this, but it's also done at airports because, again, the O'Hare incident was an accidental transfusion of a different dimension that was testing a UFO within a concentration camp in a slightly elevated and higher dimension than ours that has bent the fabric of our reality in order to adjust itself so it cannot be physically detected. But it's also done because in case there is ever some type of natural disaster or emergency, again, Denver Airport, the O'Hare International Airport incident, you name it, right? What we're going to find is that within Chicago, Denver, the deep underground military bases are corresponding to that of the zone of silence, because if anything happens, these people can just walk up into the airport and say, yeah, no problem, right? Like nothing ever happened. Now, the reason why I brought up the border and the immigration and all that is because, again, we're going to find here, this is according to theintercept.com, which, by the way, is quite a mainstream, I would dare to say, left-leaning website, and nothing against that. I'm just saying that just to show this is how mainstream it is, and I quote, "The Border Patrol is dropping migrant families in Arizona desert towns with little capacity to receive them. All right. The community of Gila Bend has declared a state of emergency as local leaders protect the new policy." And so here's the thing. End quote. I spoke about this, and I'm just putting up some other articles right now, by the way, too. See, look, the Border Patrol is dropping migrant families in Arizona desert towns with little capacity to receive them. End quote. The reason why I bring this up is because a lot of these kids are going missing because they end up being experimented on by the geneticists that are already working in a higher dimension, all right, within these certain zone of silence areas. And what we're finding here is a lot of these kids go missing. Nobody knows where they go. Seriously, they go missing, and then what ends up happening is they say, oh, well, everyone's accounted for, and how are we going to know if they're all accounted for or not? All right, just like what I said, what my friend said, rumors of instinct on the Kraken conversation episode we just did yesterday or the day before, depending on when you're seeing this. He basically said, he goes, if you really want to look, it's there. And what happens is they take these people and they use them to become shapeshifters that then shapeshift into that of a benevolent extraterrestrial being. So essentially what happens here, let me break down the process. Gate C17 is the code word used with these men in black within these underground tunnels that I gave the example of in the beginning. Once that term is used, what ends up happening is it's a very rare term. It activates a frequential telekinetic form of communication within the mind, only those with classified clearance, because these men in black know, believe me when I tell you, they know what they're doing telepathically. Most of them are, I would argue, are extraterrestrials in a lot of different ways. And so they use this telepathic ability to then communicate to other geneticists and say, listen, we need to either ascend or descend different patches of land. All right. And the reason for that is because if things are getting a little bit too suspicious, just like in this CERN this express.co.uk CERN article, this is what happens. People start asking questions. You're telling me that CERN's official excuse, CERN, all right, which already has enough shadiness surrounding it. You're telling me that CERN is saying that these geneticists and researchers were, quote, taking their sense of humor too far? Oh, come on. That might have worked 30, 40 years ago, but not today. Like, come on, you're kidding me, right? I mean, take a look at this. Look at this. I mean, look. And it's saying here that the reason for this ritual, and I quote, the aim is to allow physicists to test the predictions of different theories of particle physics. I don't understand. Now, again, when we look back at the border, some of the children are being taken away for genetic experimentation and for being able to experiment within these concentration camps that have to do with, again, the zone of silence and the very strange radioactive anomalistic occurrences. They're being experimented on. They're then being thrown onto the wall, which is an episode we did a couple weeks ago, and they're being merged. The skin is being merged together for different types of genetic experimentation. Now, what's also interesting as well, too, is that why is it that these miners are being dropped in the Arizona desert? All right. Now, you could say, Dave, yes, it's close to the border, but how coincidental? Seriously. The fact that, like I say on the Zoom calls with the Patreon members, I say it to them directly. I say it to everybody, and everyone also gives me their opinion, too, which is fantastic. Just take a look. All you need is 3 or 4 kids to go missing, and who's going to notice? Especially if ICE, the Border Patrol and all that, keeps saying like, oh, well, this and that, everything's accounted for. And ICE has been historically known to have, and this is not even a conspiracy theory, when people who are establishment politicians admit this, it's bad. Because ICE has been known to literally disobey direct orders from the White House. All right? I mean, it's true. It's honestly true, and that's what we're seeing here. What we're seeing here is different terms and fancy things being used, such as the skip zone. You know what I mean? That kind of stuff is occurring here. And so, at the end of the day, I mean, ultimately, I want you guys to let me know what you think, because what we're seeing here is that we're seeing different types of apparatuses being used within these skip zones that they're now called, or zone of silences, to use these concentration camps for these non-compliant aliens and for these children that use the term gate C17 that activate a telepathic ability to allow the men in black to understand what level or dimension they need to ascend to. And on top of that, these rituals, like the one that was caught at CERN, is what activates a new skip zone. But they have to be very peculiar and particular about where they place it. Now, they generally like to place it near certain parts of the Orion lines or the Nazca lines, because what ends up happening is, if there's an anomalistic occurrence there, all people have to say is, yeah, but there's some interesting stuff that's been going on there for thousands of years already, so not a big deal, right? Now, before I finish this episode off, I want to refer everyone to starseedportal.org. Japanese scientists succeed in making mice transparent. This is one of the key things of drop feeding that they throw in front of our face. November 8th, 2014. All right, if we round it up a few years, that's almost a decade ago. Let's be real here, right? Now let's take a look. Invisibility may be the stuff of fiction, but researchers in Japan have developed a way to make mice almost totally transparent. The techniques will give scientists a new understanding of the 3D structure of organs and how certain genes are expressed in various tissues. We were very surprised that the entire body of infant and adult mice could be made nearly transparent. All right? Here's the other thing, end quote. Take a look at the transparency. This is a very small form of how these different children and non-compliant extraterrestrials are brought up into an ascended level, into a slightly higher dimension than the one that we are in, which is why, again, go to these skip zones. You're going to see some very strange paranormal activities, because there's going to be a slight intermergence of some of the resemblance of the overall energy around that is surrounding someone in a bit of a higher dimension that will filter down back here. Right? Because again, the 3 dimension is where we were initially born, at least in this particular case with regards to us as humans, right? And this is, look, at this point, guys, I'm sorry that I'm stuttering a little bit. It's just, it's right in front of our faces. We got the CERN rituals. We got the Japanese scientists being able to make mice transparent. Why did they stop at just mice? Oh, because they lost funding? Oh, I'm sure they quote unquote lost funding. You know what I mean? So I want all of you to let me know what you think, and we'll see here again. Very quickly, it mentions organs and how certain genes are expressed in various tissues. Again, you know, the unfortunate slaughtering of the Uyghur Muslims in China. You don't think the U.S. really has a hand in that? Or you don't think Russia has a hand in that? Or Israel? Because again, on the front end, a lot of times it's a puppet show, and we must be vigilant. We must be aware. So thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll catch you tomorrow. Cheers.